So it would be in the federal government's interest, to play along according to constitutional law.
Okay, good morning. This is Jamie Souls. I'm here on the Chinook podcast. I'm here today with our regulars. Brad Donovan is here, and Pastor Nathan Zeckveld is here.
Howdy, howdy.
And we are delighted to get together to have a conversation. And today, it's our intention to have a conversation with a man by the name of Michael Wagner.
Yes.
Michael Wagner lives in Edmonton. And he is not going to be here at our table, but he is sort of.
Yes.
Because we're gonna call him and we're gonna converse with him about the book that he wrote. Mm-hmm. Michael is a longtime Christian man, and it's his. He's written a book called No Other Option, and it's on self-determination for Alberta. And we are going to have a chat with him over the next little while about his book.
All right. So before we get to him and his book, what about book reviews?
Book reviews. What do you have?
I'll start off with one here. I've got The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's a thick novel, and it actually just has some really interesting dialogue. It's based in Russia. And it actually has a lot of really interesting philosophical and psychological conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Russian.
It's Russian. So anyway, that's my book recommendation for today.
Excellent. Jamie, what do you got?
I have listened recently to, I actually listened a second time through trying to grasp the concepts here. A book by Rene Girard called I See Satan Fall Like Lightning.
Oh.
Okay. Let me just read a brief paragraph. I know this came out from a friend of mine, Darren Doan, posted this not long ago, just to give a brief overview of Rene Girard and his project. He writes this. He says, Rene Girard, it just disappeared out of my face. Where'd it go? I was looking at it and it left. Okay.
Technology.
Back to Darren Dwayne.
Where do we go? Well, it punted me right out right while I was reading it. Isn't that something?
That's sad.
Darren.
Was that the refresh button?
I'm going to look you up here. I don't even know what a refresh button is. Okay, we're going to try this again. He said this. Rene Girard, the French theorist and philosopher of mimetic rivalry, built a compelling framework for understanding human societies. His theory rested on the idea that people imitate desires. What we want is often what others want, and that this imitation leads to rivalry, conflict, and eventually the need for a scapegoat. The scapegoat serves as a release valve for collective tensions. By uniting against a common enemy, societies can restore order and maintain a semblance of peace. So that's just a brief look at the theory that I've been trying to grasp as I'm reading Rene Girard's book.
So he sounds rather pessimistic about society to me.
Well, he's not starting from theological categories when he's arguing about man and society. He's arguing from an anthropological viewpoint.
Okay.
And saying, okay, this is how societies function. And when he's a believer himself, Rene Girard is, and he has a lot of fascinating insight when he's considering the way that Christ threw a monkey wrench into this world system. It's really fascinating reading.
Interesting.
And fascinating listening. I Saw Satan Fall Like Lightning. René Girard.
All right. So for my book review, I have another Russian, War and Peace by Tolstoy.
That doesn't sound like a Russian name. War and Peace?
War and Peace.
War and Peace. Okay.
Yeah, War and Peace. Now, the Russians lately have gotten a lot of news for war, not a lot for peace, but this book is set during the Napoleonic era. It's kind of a celebration of the Russian victory over that mad Frenchman. I read it a number of years ago, and I found it quite engrossing and frustrating at the same time. There are like 4 or 5 distinct novels within that book. Mm-hmm. And that poor author should have separated them out into their own separate stories.
Like he wasn't good at the Oxford comma?
It wasn't he abused the Oxford comma at scale. I mean, like he had 4 or 5 distinct storylines that could have been individual novels. But no, he put them all smashed together between the covers of one book. So
he's a Russian.
He's a Russian. I mean, they're not going to say anything unless they say everything. So, but deeply entertaining. I enjoyed it. You know,
I love Russian writing.
Yes,
like they're extremely cynical.
Oh, very
extremely
melodramatic,
depressive.
Oh, they're melodramatic. I mean, they make a teenage boy look like he's cheerful.
It brings out my inner melodramatic Dutchman.
Puddleglum.
That's right, yeah.
All right, shall we?
All right, we're going to give Michael Wagner a phone call.
Let's see if this works. A ringtone.
Hello?
Hello, Michael. This is Nathan Zuckfeld calling you through the Chinook podcast.
Hi, how are you?
Good, and how are you doing?
Pretty good, thank you.
Good. I've got a couple co-hosts here as well, and I'll let them introduce themselves to
All
you.
right, hey, Michael, you and I know one another. This is Jamie Soulis here.
Yeah, hi. We've met many, many years ago, and I've got all your music. So.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And this is Brad Donovan. Pleasure to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you as well.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, so I'll just get rolling on this interview.
Sure.
I'll just start off by asking the question, who are you? Where do you study? What are some of your degrees? Do you have a family? What kind of church do you go to?
Yeah, basic biography.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'm a Bible-believing Christian. I go to a small Presbyterian church here in Edmonton. And, yeah, my wife and I have been married for 35 years. We have 11 children.
Boy, that's not like a whole lot, is it? Oh,
well,
yeah, good
for
for
some
you.
people it is, you know. You know, when I tell people I have 11 children, the first question is, "Are you serious?" And of course, I'm serious. The second question is, "Are you crazy?" And that's a harder question to answer.
Yeah,
not crazy at all.
No. Yeah, I mean, I have 6, and I get the same question, so I think their standards are out to lunch.
Yeah. So, just to make a long story short, I went to University of Calgary and got a BA in the 1980s, and then I did a master's degree in the early 1990s there at the University of Calgary, and then a PhD at the University of Alberta, all in political science. And then graduate school, kind of my area of expertise was actually education policy in Alberta. So,
cool.
My master's, my master's thesis was on the debate about private education in Alberta in the 1980s, because it was very controversial, of course. And then my PhD dissertation was more generally on education policy in Alberta. So my university studies weren't per se on the topic we'll be discussing today, Alberta independence, but I did learn a lot about Alberta politics in Alberta at that time. So.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I studied at the University of Calgary, University of Alberta, and that's where my degrees are from. So that's a really brief biography. I guess I can also add I'm a columnist for the Western Standard. I've been a columnist there for more than 4 years, and I've done some writing in the past for Christian Renewal magazine and Reform Perspective magazine. Anyway, that's kind of a biography in a nutshell. So. Yeah,
so you would know Ted Byfield.
Yes, I did know Ted. I ended up meeting him. Actually, I got to know him mostly through the Christian History Project. He did a 12-volume history of Christianity that finished in 2013, and so they asked me to do to write study guides for each of those 12 volumes. So I was working part-time for him for a couple of years from 2012 to 2014. So that's kind of where I got to know him the best, was when I was working for him part-time. And, then we maintained a relationship afterwards until he passed away in 2021. That was quite a highlight for me because in the 80s in particular, when I was a young man subscribing to Alberta Report, and Ted Byfield was my hero. And, he was past that time as well. But, I learned so much about Alberta politics and conservatism from a Canadian perspective from him. And so when I finally got to meet him and get to know him, it was really quite a highlight of my life, actually.
Well, that's cool. I would have loved to have met him myself. We'll head into the second question. So we've all been reading No Other Option: Self-Determination for Alberta over the last week, and we're wondering why you wrote that book and what inspired it.
Yeah, well, it actually goes back to an earlier book. I had written a previous book in 2009 called Alberta Separatism Then and Now, which was a history of Alberta separatism. And that book did not take off at all. There was no sales for it, basically. That was back when Stephen Harper was prime minister, and so there was really no interest in Alberta separatism or independence at that time. So the publisher ended up actually pulling the book. There was so little interest in it. But then when Justin Trudeau came on the scene and became leader of the Liberal Party and then prime minister, I told him there's going to be the publisher, I told him there's going to be a lot of interest in that book now with Justin Trudeau in power. He brought it back, and sure enough, there was a bit of interest, especially if you remember in 2019 when Justin Trudeau was reelected, there was a big surge of support for independence in Alberta. There was a movement called the Wexit movement, and they held some very large meetings around Alberta, and I'd become friends with the leader of that, and so he asked me to sell my book at those meetings, and that's where finally got some exposure. And then people were saying, well, this book's from 2009, you need to update it. So I had several people ask me to update it, but I didn't want to update it. What I wanted to do instead was write a whole different book, because that first book, Alberta Separatism Then and Now, was like a history of the movement. It was written from a very positive perspective. I really wanted to show that why the separatist movement had arisen in Alberta. And so it was very sympathetic, but it wasn't presenting the case per se. So I thought instead of updating that one, I wanted to actually spend a whole book presenting the case for Alberta independence. So it was because people were kind of prodding me to write something more that I thought, well, I better write this other book. So that's kind of the origin of No Other Option, was that people were kind of asking me to write something more. And I saw in the meantime that there was more information that people needed to hear, more people needed to hear the real reasons for Alberta independence, because there's very strong reasons for it. And a lot of them are historical reasons, which, people these days don't remember. And so I wanted to bring back some of these historical facts and episodes from, the recent past, last few decades, as to why Alberta needs to pursue independence. So that's essentially the origin of the book.
So
Okay.
would you mind just going over some of that, sketching some of that history? Because not all of our listeners are going to have a solid grasp on Alberta history.
Sure. What's called Western alienation or discontent in Western Canada goes back, to the very early period of our provinces, like Alberta and Saskatchewan were formed in 1905, and Manitoba a few years before that. But there was discontent with the status of the prairie provinces in Alberta, or in Canada, for decades. Farmers were complaining, and there was various political movements to try and improve the situation of the West in Canada. There was a federal progressive party in the 1920s that made a bit of a difference, and then we had Social Credit Party and so on. But there was never a movement for independence until Pierre Trudeau became prime minister. So when Pierre Trudeau became prime minister in the late 1960s, we began to see for the very first time interest in Alberta becoming independent. And part of that, initially it was because Pierre Trudeau came, part of his agenda in becoming prime minister was he wanted to make Quebecers feel much more at home within all of Canada. So he brought in the Official Languages Act, which would bring in lots of new French language materials into the prairies, essentially like French signs and things like that. And a lot of people didn't see the necessity of that, and they felt that they were having fresh French forced on them. So that was kind of the initial instigation of some minor support for Alberta independence. But what really made it go big was the energy conflict between Alberta and the federal government. In 1973, there was a war in the Middle East, and the price of oil skyrocketed. Alberta, we just had a major oil discovery in 1947 in Leduc, and that dramatically increased Alberta's economic prosperity. Until that time, Alberta was one of the poorer provinces within Canada, but the discovery of oil in 1947 made us kind of put us in the mid-range of the provinces. oil was a really good resource to have, and it really helped Alberta. But still, the price of oil back in the 50s and into the 60s was only like around $3 a barrel or something. So it wasn't a huge, it wasn't real a huge cash cow that would become later. So in 1973, there's a war. Yeah. In 1973, there's a war in the Middle East. The price of oil skyrockets. Suddenly, Alberta's resources are worth a lot. Mm-hmm. And Pierre Trudeau steps in, and he imposed what was the first time in Canadian history an export tax on the product. Like, Alberta exported a lot of oil to the United States, and Trudeau put an export tax on that so that the federal government would take a whole bunch of that revenue of Alberta's oil. Like in Canada, the provinces own the resources or have control over the resources, and they benefit from the resources. And here was Trudeau, for the federal government taking a whole bunch of money that should have been Alberta's through this export tax. He also imposed a Canadian price on oil that was much lower than the world price. So when Alberta sold oil within Canada, we'd get much less than we should have got according to the market price. And when we sold it to the United States, we lost a whole bunch of the revenue that we should have received because of that export tax on oil. So there was a huge conflict then between the federal government under Trudeau and Alberta under Peter Lougheed. Like, Peter Lougheed fought very hard for Alberta, throughout the 1970s, trying to get Alberta to get its proper share of the resources. And he pointed out, if the oil was in Ontario rather than Alberta, all Canadians would be paying the world price. But because it's in Alberta, Central Canadians, especially in Ontario, felt that they had the right to get our oil at a much lower price than the world price. So that kind of started the real strong conflict between Alberta and the federal government. And, I'd like to point out, this is unprecedented in Canadian history. There was never another province in Canadian history that was attacked by the federal government the way that Alberta was attacked in the 1970s and the 1980s.
Wow.
So there was a lot of conflict between the province and Ottawa. And so during the 1970s, you start to get, the Alberta independence ideas, separatist ideas, become much stronger, and you start to get organizations formed, and holding meetings and things. Still, it didn't really take off that much. It was growing, but it was still relatively small. And so when they did surveys on support for Alberta independence in the 1970s, it was usually in the single digit support, like 6 or 7 or 8% or something. But what really changed things was in 1980, well, first I should add, in 1979, Pierre Trudeau lost the federal election, and Joe Clark won a minority government under the Progressive Conservatives.
Joe who?
But as a minority government. Sorry?
Joe who?
Yeah, Joe who. Yeah, exactly. That's what people would say. So he was only in power, though, for a few months because it was a minority government.
Yep.
So there was a federal election in early 1980 because of the fall of the Joe Clark government. And essentially the Liberal Party was campaigning on putting Alberta in its place. Like one of the top Liberal campaign aides later would say that their unspoken motto in that campaign was "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." Like they were campaigning against Alberta. We're going to put Alberta in its place if we get elected, and they did get reelected. Trudeau got reelected. It was the end of February 1980. So now he came back with a vengeance, and then within a few months he instituted what's called the National Energy Program. And most Albertans still have some concept of the National Energy Program, even though it happened so many years ago. And this was like, the ultimate federal power grab over Alberta's resources, that the federal government would benefit much more than Alberta would, even at the expense of Alberta's constitutional jurisdiction. So because of the National Energy Program, we had a big surge of support for separatism in Alberta. In 1982, there was a by-election in Old Tisbury constituency, and the candidate for the Western Canada Concept Party, which was a separatist party, won that by-election. So it was the first time a separatist candidate was ever elected in Western Canada. So it was quite a big deal. Like, there was a surge of support, and that's kind of when when it really put separatism on the map in Alberta, was to get somebody elected. Now, to make a long story short, Peter Lougheed saw the growth of the Western Canada Concept Party, and he wanted to head it off. So he called an early provincial election. And to make a long story short, there was a lot of internal conflict within the Western Canada Concept, and so that kind of discredited them in the eyes of the voters, and also the strength of Peter Lougheed, as a premier in fighting Ottawa. Those two factors led to Peter Lougheed winning a massive majority and kind of eliminating the Western Canada Concept Party. So that kind of killed it off at that time. But that's kind of in a nutshell, the rise of the Alberta separatist movement. It would start to pick up again. We'll see what happened then after that 1982 provincial election. 2 years later, Pierre Trudeau resigned, and there was a federal election, and it was won in a massive majority by Brian Mulroney, the Progressive Conservative Party leader. And all of Alberta's members of Parliament were with the Conservative Party, and they were now part of this Brian Mulroney government. And it was felt that, our years of fighting the federal government were over. We've now got a sympathetic federal government. All of our guys are in the government. Everything's going to turn out well. But then in 1986, which was just 2 years later, Mulroney really shafted the West because Canada had recently purchased the CF-18 fighter jets, and there needed to be a place where they would be maintained. There was only 2 cities in Canada with the facilities to maintain the fighter jets, Montreal and Winnipeg. So the federal government held a competition to see which city would be best for maintaining the fighters, and Winnipeg won the contract based upon the government's criteria, and then Mulroney awarded the contract to Montreal anyway because he was more concerned about the votes for Montreal. So that shafting of the West led to so much anger in the West that it created the Reform Party, essentially. That was the single biggest factor for the creation of the Reform Party, which, of course, was not an independent party, but it was a Western rights party, and their motto was "the West wants in." Like, this was kind of the last straw that for the Westerners have been left out of national decision-making for so many years, for so many decades. We want to have our own federal political party, to send our MPs to Ottawa so that we get our voice in Ottawa. So that was kind of the impetus for the creation of the Reform Party. And then in the 1993 federal election, the Reform Party won 52 seats in the West.
Yeah, I remember that.
But but to make a long story short, their agenda for fighting for Western Canada, like, they weren't able to achieve the things that they really wanted to for Western Canada. And also over time, they took on more of a focus of trying to become a national party. And in order to do that, they had to kind of minimize their Western priorities, to appeal to Eastern Canada. Now, their effort to become a national party didn't turn out either, but that's kind of what started to undermine their commitment to specifically Western concerns. So, again, to make a long story short, then the Reform Party became the Canadian Alliance in the year 2000 because they were trying to reach out to the West. Then in 2003, the Canadian Alliance merged with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the new Conservative Party of Canada. And then under Stephen Harper, Stephen Harper had been one of the first Reform Party MPs elected in 1983, so he was known as a pro-West politician. He became leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and then became Prime Minister in 2006. And actually, when he won as Prime Minister, in his speech, he said, "The West is now in." Like, he was referring back to that Reform Party slogan, "The West wants in," and say, "Well, the West is now in." But to make a long story short, again, like, it wasn't as in as we would have liked to have been. And so then when he lost power in 2015 to Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau, very much is concerned about climate change and basically shutting down the production of fossil fuels as a way of mitigating climate change, which is a direct attack on Alberta and its resources. So, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of led to a big upsurge in support for Western independence with Justin Trudeau back in power. So I guess I think I just gave kind of a really brief historical overview of the movement and the ups and downs and stuff over that time. So I hope that covers what you needed in that question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was born in 85, so I was born in the midst of the the economic doldrums of the mid 80s. And my dad had worked on service rigs before that. And I think from 1983 through to 1990 or 91, he never held a job for more than 6 consecutive months.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, like, it was, he went from making $80,000-$85,000 a year on a service rig as a medic in 1982 to never holding a job for the next half decade or more for more than 6 months consecutively.
Yeah, like, there was a real collapse in the oil prices beginning in the 1980s.
Yeah.
First, like, the National Energy Program, when the National Energy Program came in, it came in just before that collapse in prices, and it started kind of knocking the legs out of the Alberta oil industry first.
Yeah.
And then it was shortly after that there was the oil price collapse, which really hammered the industry. So it was kind of like a double blow to the industry. Like, I know many people on the left say it was just the oil price collapse that hurt Alberta, but there's economists who have done studies who can show, however the economists show things with their figures, that the National Energy Program had an independent negative impact on Alberta, very harmful to Alberta, in addition to the collapse in the oil prices. But that collapse in oil prices, it took, like you said, I think to the early 90s before the prices really began to recover again, and the industry began to build up again. Yeah,
like, I grew up in Fort St. John over in BC, and I think it was the early 90s, like 93, 94, when Canadian Natural spun off what's now CNRL as a private enterprise, and CNRL is now one of the largest players in the oil patch here in northern Alberta and in northern BC. But I remember we started drilling holes in the ground like it was going out of style. Like, we were madmen on drilling rigs in 95 and 6. They punched a couple hundred holes up by Ladyfern 1 and 2, north of Fort St. John in the mid to late 90s. As soon as they privatized that, it was
wow, yeah.
it was something else.
Yeah, well, like the industry was booming again then, I guess, by that point, and it boomed, right through the early 2000s. Like, I remember in the early 2000s, they were concerned about peak oil, that we were going to reach our maximum capacity or something like that. But, the prices went up really high until the financial collapse in 2008. But yeah, that's neat.
Yeah, so
maybe talk to us, Michael, about the system that has been set up, equalization payment systems. Talk to us about that. I've been a Canadian. I was born here in Canada in 1965. I've been watching these things for a long, long while, and sort of sleepwalking along. I'm part of Canada. I like our maple leaf. I think it's a great thing. And CBC has Hockey Night in Canada. That was the Western unity with Canada thing, I'm sure, was Hockey Night in Canada. But we get this broad sense of we're Canadian, and the idea of separatism. It never really registered with me until I actually read your book. It just seems like while we're existing here and we're doing what we can, and there's always problems with Ottawa, but when you really start enumerating what some of those problems are, that's pretty eye-opening. So talk to us a little bit about equalization stuff, equalization payments.
Sure. Like the equalization program, in an abstract sense, that actually makes sense. The idea of the equalization program is that everybody in Canada should have like equal access to government services, like whether you're in Nova Scotia or PEI or Alberta, Ontario, whatever, there should be equal access to government services. And so the provinces with a lot more revenue should contribute a bit more so that the provinces that have less revenue, that revenue can be transferred to them so that they can offer an equal amount of services to their people, so that we have this kind of equal amount of services to everybody across Canada. So everybody's equal that way. So in that abstract sense, it makes sense, And the equalization program is actually just one part of what are called fiscal transfers. Like there's an economist at the University of Calgary named Robert Manzel, and he studies this. And so what he likes to talk about, not just equalization, but fiscal transfers, because there's other transfers. There's a health transfer. I can't remember all these others, but when you add them all together, Alberta is making a huge contribution to Canada every year. Like the equalization program is so many billions per year, and then there's a health transfer is so many billions. And if you add up all these different programs and the transfers, Robert Manzel calculated that from 1965 until 2018, Alberta had made a net transfer to Canada of $630 billion. And Of course, that's up to 2018. And so there's been billions of dollars every year since then. So it'd be much more than that now, but I haven't seen an updated figure. So Alberta has been contributing way more to Canada than any other province by far. And, this is because of because of our oil resources. And I don't think Albertans mind the idea in general, abstractly, of contributing more to Canada because we're wealthier, but it's so much more. Like they've taken so much from us, and they criticize us and call us greedy at the same time.
Yeah, I know.
I'm greedy because I want to keep some of my stuff. Okay, I see where this is going.
Exactly. And actually, now that when it came to, I mentioned some economists who studied the National Energy Program and the harm that it caused to Alberta. Like with that oil price collapse in the 1980s, that was very bad for Alberta's economy. Like we had really high unemployment with the collapse of oil prices. But because the National Energy Program was still there, it was actually still pulling billions of dollars out of Alberta. That if it had been left in Alberta, those billions had been left in Alberta, they could have spawned new industries and new businesses so that our unemployment rate wouldn't have been so high. But but the effect was still, to pull more out of Alberta, even though at that time we were hurting economically. So the effect on Alberta's economy, of course, is really negative when you're sucking that much money out.
Yeah.
And Albertans, when it's that much money over that period of time, it's bound to create a sense of resentment. You know what I mean? Like, that's a lot of money, and that's going to, and of course, a disproportionate amount goes to Quebec, and that also adds, to some of the resentment too, because just a few years ago, Quebec blocked one of the pipelines that Alberta wanted to build a pipeline. I think it was called Energy East.
Yeah, I remember that.
Quebec said there's no way Quebec said there's no way we're letting that pipeline go across our territory, even though it's actually a federal responsibility, not a provincial one. But with Trudeau in power, he's not going to oppose what Quebec wants. But here, and actually, the Premier of Quebec, if I remember at the time, or also the leader of the Bloc Québécois, one of the two, was criticizing Alberta's dirty oil. We don't want Alberta's dirty oil. Well, they don't want our oil, but they sure want the money they get from us from selling our oil. You know what I mean? So these kinds of hypocritical statements and things, they just add to the anger that Albertans feel, about giving so much money to Quebec when Quebec's not supporting our industry.
Speaking of Quebec, if I could get away with starting a federal party in Alberta that was for Quebec separatism, I would.
You get a lot of support out here for that, yeah.
Well, now correct me if I'm wrong. I was always under the impression that you remember the 1994 Quebec sovereignty referendum that was a close run thing. We very narrowly had salvation. It was so close. But anyway, so the I was cheering for the wrong side apparently. But correct me if I'm wrong. I believe, or I've been under the impression that these fiscal transfers were actually increased to Quebec in the wake of that to keep them in Confederation, like we bribed them with Alberta money. I think.
I don't have exact figures on that, but I wouldn't doubt there's something like that. Like, I do know that, this is one of the marks against Stephen Harper as Prime Minister, I do know that Stephen Harper increased equalization payments to Quebec after he became Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And that was because, he of course, he had a minority government at first, and he wanted to get more seats in Quebec, as all conservative prime ministers, or all prime ministers want to. So he actually increased equalization payments. So I do know that. So, but I know that too, that in the debates about separatism in Quebec, that one of the arguments that the Federalists use is that we'll lose these payments from Canada if we become independent. So it does look like those payments to Quebec are in a sense, or at least in some cases, like a bribe to keep Quebec in, like you say. You know what I mean? So there is that aspect to it.
An independent Quebec would be a poor place.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, they would suddenly not get any money from Alberta anymore.
Yeah.
So Alberta would be better off, and Quebec would be worse off. So I mean, and they've been getting. Quebec has been the single biggest recipient of equalization payments going back several decades. I can't remember exactly how far. But I mean, it really benefits Quebec to stay in Canada, financially. Well, in fact, there was one of the premiers of Quebec several years ago referred to what he called profitable federalism because it was financially beneficial. That was an actual term, because it's beneficial for them financially to stay within Canada.
Yeah.
So why not, right?
Right. So, we should like some profitable federalism as well. So one of the things that, for myself, like I've been hovering around the edges of this independence idea for a good long while now. But one of the things that I think kind of convinced me that we really are better off doing our own thing or something is that once we got toward the end of Harper's time as Prime Minister, it really became clear that it didn't matter how much we scrapped for a seat at the table. The table was never open to us because, we didn't see any proportionate seat redistribution in Alberta's favor, for example. By way of example, my MP here in Grand Prairie, Chris Workington, he has the same number of people in his riding as the entire province of Prince Edward Island.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got 4 seats.
They've got 4 seats.
Yeah. So Prince Edward Island has 4 times as much representation as I do.
Yeah.
Right. And so I didn't see any seat redistribution towards the end of Harper's time as Prime Minister. And then when we got Trudeau, I mean, that ship was sunk immediately. So I look at that and I'm like, I don't see any way for Alberta to have a voice commensurate with her power within Confederation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like there's Alberta is like I think Alberta and BC like are at a disadvantage when it comes to the number of people per electoral district. Like
Right.
the Maritimes are guaranteed certain numbers of seats based on some formula back several generations ago, and in order to balance it out properly, some provinces have to lose out, and Alberta and BC, especially Alberta, ends up being one of the ones to lose out, and so we even have less power than we ought to have by our population. And if we had those more seats, it probably wouldn't be enough to make a huge difference, but it would just be more fair if we were given that representation in Parliament. And this kind of relates a little bit to one of the big issues that the Reform Party fought for, and that was Senate reform, because we're even more disadvantaged in the Senate. Like the Senate is supposed to be a body that represents regions, in the federal government, but the Canadian Senate is completely unbalanced regionally as well. Like Quebec and Ontario have half of the senators, and most of the rest are in the Maritimes. And so Alberta, I think, might have 6 or something like that out of 100. Like it's very, very disproportionate in the Senate. And like this is one thing that Stephen Harper did try to do as Prime Minister. He did. He tried to reform the Senate with the power that he had as Prime Minister, and he wasn't able to. I mean, he had opposition from various premiers. He had opposition. And even from within his own caucus, right? Because in order for Stephen Harper to be Prime Minister, he had to have a large caucus from Ontario, and a lot of those people weren't interested in Senate reform either. So, and then ultimately he was blocked by the Supreme Court. But Stephen Harper did try and do something for Senate reform, which had been something going back to the Reform Party days. So whether it's the Senate or the House of Commons, Alberta is disadvantaged. Based on population, we don't get the representation we should have based on our population.
Now, could you talk about the Supreme Court as well? Because I remember speaking with our MP, Chris Workington, and he mentioned to me the fact that the Supreme Court, in his opinion, was nothing but a revolutionary body.
Oh, actually, yeah. Like this is going into the direction of a different book I wrote on the Charter of Rights. See, the Charter of Rights, this is another initiative of Pierre Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau brought in, what's called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, and it fundamentally restructured Canada's system of government. Like originally, our system of government was based on the British system, more along the British system. We still have some of that, which was parliamentary supremacy, that the Parliament was a supreme decision-making body, for the government, for the country. Whereas the Americans had what was called they call it constitutional supremacy, but it was really judicial supremacy because it gives the judges the power to interpret. And that's what Pierre Trudeau wanted that for Canada. He wanted a judicial supremacy where by adopting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there was a deliberate transfer of power from the Parliament to the Supreme Court. So before the Charter was adopted in 1982, it was very, very difficult for some kind of law or public policy to be struck down by the Supreme Court because that just wasn't our system of government. So by adopting the Charter, and this was consciously Trudeau's plan, because Trudeau first introduced the idea of a Charter of Rights in 1968 when he was Justice Minister, and it was actually published as a book by the federal government, his proposal for the Charter of Rights. And he wrote in there specifically that, this will mean we'll have to transfer some power from the politicians to the judges. So, that was very much part of his plan and his program. And so, when the Charter came in, it meant that the judges, and in particular the Supreme Court, was given a huge amount of political power it never had before. And so they were able to make a huge difference in Canadian public policy. So what your MP said is exactly right. And in fact, if I can, in 1985, see, the Charter was adopted in 1985, but there was a 3-year waiting period so that the federal government and the provinces could adjust their laws to the Charter so that there wouldn't be as many court challenges to the laws. They gave them 3 years to change laws to make them conform to the Charter. And in 1985, when the Charter was about to, take its full effect, the Justice Minister at that time was John Crosbie of the Mulroney government. And John Crosbie said publicly, he said, people don't realize how much of a revolution this is. He actually used the word that the Charter of Rights was a revolution in Canadian society. So your MP is 100% right. The Charter of Rights was sorry.
Oh, no, I was just saying, I was questioning in my head, when were Canada's abortion laws struck down?
82.
Was it 82?
88.
It was 88 when it actually happened.
Oh, I thought, okay.
Because I'm pretty sure that would not have happened had not the because there wasn't an avenue for that to happen.
Yeah.
Had we been working prior to 1982.
Yeah, prior to the 85 thing, it would have had to gone through Parliament, not the Supreme Court.
So that's fascinating to think about, because when I remember watching Justin Trudeau talking about abortion as being his core value.
Yeah,
I remember him talking that way. Like, this is a core value. A core value is what you keep when everything else is gone. You keep your core value. His core value is abortion.
Yeah.
I think that's part of what Pierre was shooting for.
Mm-hmm.
That sure looks like it to me.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, there's two parts to the abortion being struck down in Canada. Like, the first part is, Canada, abortion was illegal in Canada until 1969. And then Pierre Trudeau, as Prime Minister, one of his first laws, he loosened the restrictions. Like, he didn't make it a freewheeling, freewheeling abortion on demand, but he did loosen the restrictions. So from 1969 onwards, women could get abortions in some hospitals if there was a therapeutic abortion committee. That was a committee of 3 doctors, and they would have to verify that the woman's well-being was at stake, and so to give her permission to get an abortion. So in 1969, abortion was legalized to a limited extent in Canada. Mm-hmm. Now, that the therapeutic abortion committees kind of worked as rubber stamps, and so if a woman asked for abortion, she'd get it.
Right.
So, but still, it had to be in a hospital, and a lot of places, some of the provinces actually, at least in some areas, didn't have hospitals that offered abortion. So it wasn't like abortion on demand like we have now. But even that small amount of restriction was offensive to Henry Morgentaler, which was who was our main abortion doctor. He wanted abortions done in private clinics that he was, and he won this fight first in Quebec, because Quebec was a more liberal jurisdiction. But when he brought an abortion clinic to Ontario, like to English Canada, that set off the court case that led to the Supreme Court striking down all of all of Canada's abortion restrictions in 1988, the famous Morgentaler decision. So it was that was the second step. Like, the first step, there was a limited legalization in 1969, and then the full legalization, like the complete opening up of it, was 1988 with the Supreme Court. And of course, like you say, it's unlikely the Supreme Court would have had the authority to strike down that law without the Charter of Rights.
Now, speaking of the Charter of Rights, I remember reading something, because the Queen had to actually hand over the Charter in 82 because she had our original constitutional documents, that because of the way Confederation worked. And I remember reading her advisor for Canada, for the Dominion of Canada, told her that this was a bad idea. Mm-hmm. And she signed them over to Trudeau anyway. I think in large part because of the mess that she'd run into in Australia in 1974 with their constitutional crisis, when she told them to go back to the polls. And I think she just didn't want to do anything with Canada. I think she maybe was tired. The Falklands War was also going on in 82. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot on the plate, but it seems to me that the surrender of the Charter to Trudeau, like, we really gave the key to the asylum to an inmate, and we oughtn't to have. Yeah. Like, this is a bad deal. Yeah. I'm a big fan of parliamentary supremacy, because I can get Chris Workington to go marching down to Ottawa to get a law changed. But the Supreme Court, I can't touch them. Like, what are my levers on the Supreme Court? So
well, if you have a lot of money and a good lawyer.
Yes. And that is another incentive to be looking at separatism.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I know you're totally right. Like, if we want to change our constitution, like, there's almost zero chance of Canada's constitution being changed anytime in the next few decades. Right. But if we were an independent country, we could write a constitution from scratch that would be, a good constitution. That's absolutely an excellent argument. Yeah. And I just throw in here, at the time, like right now, like, so many Canadians think, well, the Charter, that's our key document. That's what makes us Canadians and stuff. It's such a popular document now when they do surveys. But at the time, in the early 80s, there was a lot of opposition to it. Yeah. And especially in Alberta, like, Alberta was kind of the hotbed of opposition to the Charter of Rights. And we had a woman here, actually, a lady, a very famous woman lawyer named Ruth Gorman. She was one of the founders of that Western Canada Concept Party that I mentioned, and she was a famous as a lawyer, and she traveled around Alberta trying to encourage people to oppose the charter because she really thought Trudeau was doing something harmful to Canada and to Alberta in particular, and she was right.
Yep.
Anyway, there was a lot of opposition back then, and people don't remember that anymore.
Yep. Well, I remember studying the charter in high school. I was in high school in the 90s, so we still did some civics, I guess. But I remember looking at this thing, and I started reading it. I made this mistake in school of reading the textbooks my teachers gave me. So
Foolish boy.
Yeah, foolish boy. So I was reading the charter, right? And I'm like, oh, this is a very interesting document. And then I start looking at it, and I realize something. There are more provisions that allow me or the right to speak in French than own property.
Absolutely.
Like there's a couple of sections in that thing about the French language, and there's a brief statement in passing on property, which actually doesn't guarantee anything. Which I found very interesting because I would argue that private property is one of the constitutional cornerstones of the British system. That a man has a right not to have his stuff stolen by the government, I think, should be self-evident. But if you even go back to Magna Carta and it's in there, with force, in Article 64. But I find it very interesting that I have more right to speak French, be spoken to in French,
than you do to own your own home.
Yeah, or my own firearms,
or your own firearms.
Yeah, that's another one. Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a very key thing. And I mentioned that Ruth Gorman, that was her number one criticism of the charter was property rights were deliberately removed from the main section of the rights, our guarantees of rights and freedoms. And originally, there was an original proposal that includes property rights, and the NDP told Trudeau that if he would remove property rights from the proposal, that the NDP would support him with the charter. And so he did. I mean, he wasn't very committed to property rights to begin with, so he was happy to give that up. That gave the Liberals, Liberals already had a majority. They gave NDP support, so it kind of increased their momentum for being able to pull the charter into the Constitution because they had that much more support. But that taking out property rights is really, really important because when you think of the English-speaking nations, like historically, we've had the rights to life, liberty, and property. Like that was the John Locke's famous calculation, right, with or equation. The rights to life, liberty, and property. And so up until that time, in all the English-speaking nations, these are the three key rights that were the basis for everything else. And they all limit government. Right? The right to life limits the government's ability to kill people unjustifiably. The right to liberty limits the government's ability to incarcerate people. The right to property limits the government's ability to take things. So these are limitations on the government. So when you remove one of those three, when you remove property rights from that, it actually increases the power of the government because there's one less restriction on the government. And that's a message to the judges. Like when the judges look at that and see, they deliberately excluded property rights, that means they deliberately excluded more restrictions on the government's power. So adopting the charter without property rights actually enhanced the power of the state in this perspective. Yeah. Because it removed one of those protections for us.
Yeah. And speaking about Alberta and making money, one of the things I think that should be considered a man's property is the fruits of his labor. And so this gives excuse to and room for exorbitant taxation and extortionate taxation.
I was just thinking about the French and their three. Their three things: liberty, fraternity, equality. They said.
And they wound up with none of them.
And all of those open the door wide, at least through their interpretation. All of those open the door wide to state intervention.
Yep.
All of them do.
Yep. Yep.
State intervention.
Actually, if I can just tie.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Sorry, but I just want to tie a few of these things together. When we talked about abortion, it was Pierre Trudeau who legalized abortion in Canada for the first time. We talked about the Charter of Rights. And that was Pierre Trudeau's baby. Like he was the one who introduced that and pushed that through. And then when we talk about the origin of the Alberta separatist movement, that was Pierre Trudeau as well. Like Pierre Trudeau is a central figure in the destruction of Canada, in my perspective. Like, yes, he was one of the smartest prime ministers ever. and he might have had some personal virtues, but he was so destructive. Like, he was really, Pierre Trudeau, I consider to be the founder of modern Canada.
Yeah.
Because, he legalized abortion, he legalized homosexuality, he brought the Charter of Rights, essentially constitutionalized his vision for the country. And so the Supreme Court, even today, as it carries out decisions, is implementing Pierre Trudeau's vision of Canada. And then he started, like I said, it was because of him that the Alberta separatist movement started going. And now his son is the one who's fueling it the most since. So I can't help but see Pierre Trudeau as kind of like the center of just about everything bad in Canada in the last 50 years or so.
I grew up in my father's house, and my dad really did not like Pierre Trudeau. He really did not like him.
Neither did your mother.
My dad felt the same way.
My first exposure to anti-Trudeau sentiment, I was okay. So just so you know, Mike, Jamie's my uncle. Okay, so
okay.
I was a young boy, and I was over at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Right, I was chasing their goats around and doing chores. So we're sitting there eating lunch, and we're talking about politics, as one does at the dinner table in Alberta. And so I was probably 12-ish at the time, and I mentioned something that I had seen on the news, and that many people considered Pierre Trudeau to be one of the greatest prime ministers in Canadian history, because I'd heard this from my school teachers. And my grandmother very nearly murdered me at the dinner table. I had never heard. Anyway, so like if it hadn't have been 30 below, she would have kicked me out of the house. So I very quickly learned that the opinions expressed by the state broadcaster, the CBC, were wrong. and being duly chastened, sure. I repented of the error of my ways.
Well, I attribute Pierre Trudeau to me for my interest in Alberta politics and Canadian politics, because when I was a kid, like, I had some interest in international politics. Me and my friends, that was back in the days of the Cold War, when we thought military things were cool, like rockets and planes and tanks and stuff. But I wasn't interested in Canadian domestic politics until it was after the National Energy Program. Like, I was living in Calgary, and Calgary was like, Alberta's, Canada's oil capital. Yeah. So the National Energy Program hit Calgary hard. And so even though my dad wasn't in the oil industry, some of my friends, their dads were in the oil industry, and it was it felt like a real personal attack, actually. Mm-hmm. Like, it felt like a personal attack on my community. And so I was just a teenager, because I became intensely interested in opposing Trudeau, and I joined my first political party. Actually, I joined the Western Canada Concept Party at the time. I was just a teenager. I couldn't even vote, but I just felt so strongly. So that's kind of my initiation into the Alberta separatist movement, which was several decades ago. And it was because of that I ended up writing my first book on Alberta separatism, the history of Alberta separatism, because as I would go through, even though it wasn't part of my university studies, as I was researching education policy, I would often come across materials about the separatist movement. And so that kind of stuck in my mind. And eventually I thought, there needs to be a history of the Alberta separatist movement, and it would be best if it was written from a sympathetic perspective, because leftists that write about it say all kinds of kooky things about separatism, about selfishness of Albertans and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted a sympathetic history of the separatist movement to be written, because the people who were involved were very thoughtful people and caring people, and they wanted what was best for Alberta. And so that kind of played into why I ended up writing that particular book, was because I wanted people to see what the movement was really all about, from the perspective of the people who were involved. So I was, like I said, that's why I wrote it in 2009. And I was really glad that I wrote it, even though, like I said, a few years after I wrote it, the reception of it was so limited that the publisher ended up pulling it because there was no market for it at that time. But eventually, I figured that when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, Albertans felt comfortable being in Canada. Like, they knew Stephen Harper was going to defend our interests, since we weren't going to get ripped off the way Pierre Trudeau would rip us off. But I knew that once Stephen Harper was not Prime Minister anymore, eventually there'd be another Liberal Prime Minister. Yeah. And I figured that the next Liberal Prime Minister would lead to a surge in separatism, but I didn't realize it was going to be a Trudeau Liberal Prime Minister, and that just kind of supercharged the rebuilding of the movement.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a lot about separatism. Now, what would that look like? Because when you look at the geographical position and the geopolitical position, what does this look like? I mean, we're landlocked, and a separate Alberta would share a border with the United States and with Canada.
You know, I've thought about that too, and thought, you know, if you want to find the ideological borders of Alberta, you need to isolate the lower mainland of BC and incorporate the whole rest of BC. You need to incorporate Saskatchewan, and you need to incorporate Manitoba. Ideologically, it seems to me those guys all walk together. So when I think about Alberta separatism, it's hard for me to think about that rectangle with the corner cut off. Yeah.
Well, like, definitely, it would be much better. Like, a country of the 4 Western provinces would be much stronger than just Alberta by itself. That's for sure. And so that would kind of be the ideal. Like, in my perspective, that would be the ideal outcome. Would be independent Western Canada. But the way the constitutional law works, it has to be one province at a time. So Alberta would be the most likely one to go first. So if Alberta was to pull out, that would kind of hopefully create momentum for others to come. Like, Saskatchewan would probably be second. You know what I mean?
We'd pull out and offer incentives from the outside saying, hey, come on over and join us. We have cookies.
We have equalization payments.
We have the cash.
Right.
Yeah. Now, so constitutionally, you are right. We would have to do it one at a time, not as a block. I mean, the timing could be very, very close together, but it would have to be for individual provinces.
Right. See, I grew up in northern BC on the east side of the Rockies, and you know, we were in BC, but for all practical intents and purposes, the eastern side of the Rockies belongs in Alberta because they all have Albertan sensibilities. They have Albertan access. You know, you have to cross the Rockies in order to get to another city in BC.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing about this too is in the 20th and 21st century, just looking back, I can only think of one peaceful secessionist movement, and that's the breakup of Czechoslovakia in the mid 90s. Every other secessionist movement that I can think of involved fighting. And so that's something that I'm very cognizant of. What do you think about that? Do you think we could get out of this without having to go to fighting?
Absolutely, I think we could, because constitutional law in Canada allows for it. And this goes back to, like, there was earlier reference was made to the 1995 Quebec separatist referendum, which just barely missed. Now, so that was 1995. Right after that, like, there was no idea of what Canada's constitutional law would be. Like, if Quebec had voted for independence, like, what would we do? Like, there was no guidelines for that. So the federal government, after that result, sent a reference case to the Supreme Court where they asked the Supreme Court, you know, its advice on certain aspects of constitutional law. And it asked, I'm trying to remember the exact question, but the key question was, could Quebec unilaterally declare independence, you know, after a referendum based on Canadian constitutional law? And the Supreme Court said no, Quebec could not unilaterally declare independence after a successful referendum. However, if Quebec held a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority of people voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would be obligated to negotiate Quebec's independence based on that referendum. So that Quebec couldn't unilaterally declare independence, which is what I think the Parti Québécois position was. But a successful referendum result with a clear question. And that was key because I think in both the 1980 and 1995 Quebec referendums, I think the questions were kind of convoluted. And, I mean, everybody understood it was a separatist question, but the questions in and of themselves were more along the lines of, you know, do you empower the Quebec government to renegotiate Quebec's position within Canada with the federal government? So it was something that, you know, it wasn't clear. So I think the Supreme Court did a good thing in saying make it a clear question and make it a clear majority. And the reason you want a clear majority rather than just a basic majority of 50% plus one is, you know, for lots of public policies, whether it's taxes or roads and things like that, you know, 50% plus one is fine. But when you're creating a new country and fundamentally restructuring a country, you need more than 50% plus one. You need like a super majority, right? Because people really need to buy in and be part of what's happening. So They didn't define what a clear majority would be, and so there's this debate about that. But I think having a supermajority, maybe a 60% or something, makes sense when you're creating a new country and creating a new constitution. So in this way, though, the Supreme Court of Canada, like, I don't like a lot of their decisions, but this one I think was really a good one. Like, when you read it, there's a lot of wisdom in there that there is a peaceful way for any province in Canada to become independent, and it's a clear an independence referendum with a clear question and a clear majority of people voting in favor. And if you have a situation like that, it makes sense for that province to become independent, because if there's a clear majority of people of any particular province that wants out, I think it makes sense to let those people out, because that would be the democratic way of doing it, and they're not happy within the Canadian Confederation as it was, in that situation. So I think there could be a peaceful partition of the country based on those principles, because it was set in law by the Supreme Court of Canada itself. And I don't think that the federal government would really want to fight against its own constitutional law. I mean, that's what would be happening is actually, and to throw this in, is the Supreme Court actually discusses in their decision about what would happen if the federal government would throw obstacles, in the way of a province that voted in favor of independence. And it's a bit of speculation, but the Supreme Court saying, the international community will be watching what's happening. And if the federal government of Canada goes against Canada's own constitutional law in order to prevent a province from leaving, even though the province voted in favor of leaving, a lot of international players would be more sympathetic to that particular province, because they'd see the federal government violating its own law. And so you'd get, international buy-in. You'd have, recognition of the independence of that province from other countries, which is kind of the key thing when it comes to creating a new country in the world, right? So it would be in the federal government's interest, to play along according to constitutional law. And they actually, the referendum result, it doesn't guarantee the independence. What it guarantees is negotiations toward independence. So let's say Alberta voted in favor of independence. The federal government could come back and say, okay, you guys are really unhappy here and you've been unhappy for a long time. We're going to finally pay attention to you, and here's the changes we're willing to make if you'll stay in. So the federal government would have the opportunity to renegotiate a situation to keep the province in, like before that province became independent. So I think at that point, the federal government could make realistic concessions, possibly. You know what I mean?
Meaningful concessions. So, in light of the idea of the international community, did you see Donald Trump's latest meme?
About Canada becoming the 51st state. Yes.
So that might be why Trudeau scampered out of Margot Law real quickly. I think somebody might have warned him that Alberta might take Trump's threat seriously.
Some Canadian politician was talking about that. I think it was this morning I saw.
Okay.
Or maybe yesterday. and they just weren't sure if he was joking.
Oh, I think he was deadly serious.
Anyways.
So I think from reading your book, though, you're more in favor of Alberta becoming a new nation state than joining the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. There is a certain percentage of people, in Alberta who would like to see Alberta join the United States. But for me, I think that'd be counterproductive, because, right now, Alberta's complaint is that we don't, get a voice within the national government. We don't get heard within the national government because we don't have a big enough population, and so we get beat up because we have the resources.
Right.
And I think that if we joined the United States, we'd be in essentially the same position. We'd still be, a relatively lightly populated, resource-rich jurisdiction within the United States, and so it wouldn't be might not be abused quite as bad there. But I think it'd be a very similar situation. The dynamic would be the same. So when I advocate for Alberta independence, it's because then we as Albertans get to make the choice for our future. We get to elect people who are going to make decisions in our best interest. And by joining the United States, we'd lose some of that power again. So I do think that we should be independent rather than join the United States.
I've thought about that too. If the United States continues in its current way, if we don't have California seceding from the United States, or if we don't have Western,
we should trade them.
That's right. We can make a trade. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll trade California for Alberta and Saskatchewan. You got a bigger population. Okay. We'll trade you.
Yeah. Well, okay. I was talking with my kids about this thing last night, we were all sitting in the car waiting for my wife to get out of the store she was shopping in. And so we were discussing Alberta separatism, as one does in the car with my kids. And my oldest is 14, and she is a very precocious young lady who is studying classics philosophy and such. So I get these very interesting questions sometimes. But one of the things that came out in our conversation was that this very problem of representation in America. What would happen if we joined America, right? So I was listing off some of the pros. I'd get the Second Amendment, and we'd have a stronger dollar. We wouldn't have to get a passport to go visit our friends and family in Idaho. So my kids are like, well, what are the cons? And I'm like, well, we wouldn't have enough electoral college votes to protect ourselves. And the kids are like, interesting. Okay, Daddy. I'm not sure what that meant, but
okay. Here's the fix. Here's the fix. We would not be joining the United States. We would be joining Idaho.
Well, there's an Idaho separatist movement, but there's only like 15 people in it. So, right. And I think I'm related to 3 of them. But yeah, so this whole the details of how to do this.
Yeah, Brad, you mentioned earlier the fact that we're landlocked.
We are landlocked,
and that would create some.
Yeah, this does create problems,
issues in both directions. Yeah, for them and for us.
Yeah, part of the problem with being landlocked is you can't get your resources to a port. Probably the most obvious example of what is wrong with a landlocked economic power is Ethiopia. Actually, I think the next big African war is going to be in Ethiopia because their last spring, or would it be this spring still? It's this spring still. Their president went to Eritrea, their neighbor, and basically said, you give us one of our ports or else, because they've got this massive population. They're one of the largest landlocked countries in the world, and they got no way to get their product out except through Djibouti. Now, they're not going to take Djibouti by force because the Americans have a massive naval base there. Washington said no. So, but a landlocked power will always have problems getting their goods to market. And I could see, whereas in the past we were, strangled by the NEP, currently by carbon taxes and pipeline restrictions, we would suffer under the tariff and pipeline restrictions.
Right. If BC stayed in Canada, we still wouldn't have access.
Yeah, I think we need at least Prince Rupert.
Yeah, we need Prince Rupert
at least, because it's a potential deep sea port.
Or strike a deal with the
Churchill.
US.
Yeah, so that's not a year-round port, though.
Yeah.
But what do you think about the issue of geography?
Like, I'm not as concerned about it as some people, because I think, Alberta has those disadvantages, like you mentioned. But my understanding is there's a lot of goods that are brought into Vancouver that are then shipped across, to Eastern Canada, and so they'd have to come across Alberta. So if BC was going to block our access to export things, we could also block their access to the rest of Canada.
Vancouver.
So it's,
right.
So my view is, people assume that if Alberta becomes independent, we're going to have an antagonistic relationship with the rest of Canada. But I don't think we need to assume that, because it's not in Canada's best interest to fight Alberta, an independent Alberta. It's in our best interest and their best interest economically to work together to work out these issues. Because I don't think people in Canada are going to economically commit suicide just to hurt Alberta. It will hurt them economically if they cut us off and block us off, because they can't get their goods across. We also supply a lot of oil to them and things like that. So I don't understand why they would cut us off and try and block us just because we followed Canada's constitutional law to become independent. And probably these kind of things would be part of the negotiations towards independence. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You let us send stuff out through your ports, and we will let stuff that come into your ports back into the rest of Canada.
I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess the question is, in such a case, will spite rule the day, or will good common sense? The problem I have is that good common sense, it just seems to be lacking in the elites in Eastern Canada.
No, like I'm not going to argue that they have common sense, but it's their economic self-interest.
Yeah.
So economic self-interest, for the people that are voting for them, because the voters aren't going to want to hurt, don't want to lose jobs just to hurt Alberta, right? So I think ultimately the politicians who represent the voters will want to make it, they'll want the best deal that they can get, but it would involve, cooperating with Alberta rather than kind of stifling Alberta.
Right. Well, that would be an equitable arrangement, though. I mean, yeah, you want goods from Vancouver and China. We want to get natural gas and oil out. Strike a deal.
Mm-hmm. And actually, most of Alberta's oil exports are to the United States, and there's no reason why that would stop.
Yeah.
Like our pipelines go south, right?
Yep.
So our biggest trading partner is the United States, and there was no reason to think that would stop because we became independent. In fact, we might even have better relationships with them. So that would be our number one thing. But still, I do think economic self-interest would rule the day with Canada, and we'd be able to work something out with them.
Mm-hmm. I think that if an independent Alberta would have a whole lot of incentive to manufacture or to build facilities that turn our natural gas and our oil into real live products that we can use and sell, right?
Right.
We would be able to build facilities along those lines.
Yep.
Because
our entire economy is being throttled by Ottawa.
Yeah.
Like from top to bottom.
Yep.
Yeah. They don't want us making stuff.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Because if we made stuff, we'd be rich.
So the freedoms that we receive will more than offset any kind of economic disadvantages.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because freedom overcomes all sorts of disadvantages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
It does. I mean, look at America, right? She was being throttled by England, and then she got her independence. Now look at her.
Yep.
Yeah. So, excellent.
All right. Well, I think we should probably be pushing towards a conclusion. I think we've been going for about an hour with you now.
Okay.
So one of the final questions that I want to ask is, what would you say is the role that the church should play? What is your vision for the church in the West? Because here on Chinook Podcast, we're all elders in the local church up here in Grand Prairie. And we have a deep interest in seeing the church flourish in whatever nation God places us in. Right. Yeah. Well, like ultimately the key thing is, for Alberta or Canada to turn back to God. Like that's the fundamental thing. I mean, there are many Christians in the Alberta separatist movement. I've met many. I'm surprised actually how many are there. But I would never say that if you're a Christian, you have to be an Alberta separatist. It's not like abortion or same-sex marriage where the Bible gives clear guidelines.
Right.
Like I see my support for, Alberta separatism in terms of from a scriptural mandate, more in terms of like that verse in Jeremiah about looking out for the well-being of your city. Like from a pragmatic perspective, I think this is the best way to pursue what's best for Alberta. But it's not a scriptural, issue like abortion or same-sex marriage or something like that. So I would never say this is the Christian position. That Christians can still, I think, legitimately Christians can hold a position that Alberta should stay within Canada. And I have a good friend who said, even if Alberta becomes independent, if it doesn't turn to Christ, we're not any further ahead. And that's true. Like fundamentally,
I've thought that myself.
The fundamental thing. Fundamentally, the thing is, our Alberta and Canada have to turn to Christ, and without that, even an independent Alberta is going to go under without God. So, like, I do keep that in mind, but just from a political federalist perspective, I think Alberta would be better off independent in this current circumstances. So I'm not sure if that really gets to what you're trying to get at, but fundamentally, we're toast without God, even if we become independent.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a good answer, Michael. There's we have to look out for the good of our neighbors, right? For our city, we need to be working for her good, and there are different visions of how to work for the good of the city. If I'm in Justin Trudeau's cabinet, I'm still working for what I think is the good of the city. But it looks to me, the Christian believer, it makes me think, well, goodness, they're operating from a different paradigm than I am. So we do want to look out for such matters.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay. Well, Michael, thank you very much for coming and talk to us.
Sorry, we did have one more question.
Nathan's got another question.
Yeah. Where can we find your books?
Oh, okay. Well, the book that you first mentioned, No Other Option, that's actually available on Amazon.com. But most of my books are available on a website called merchantship.ca. That's actually, Merchantship is a small business based in Disbury, Alberta. It's a homeschooling business. They sell homeschooling supplies, but they're friends of mine, so they also sell my books. So if you go to merchantship.ca and type in my name, No Other Option is there, plus my other books on independence and other books about Trudeau in Canada are there.
Right. And you did write one on the 1982 the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. What was that book called?
It's called Leaving God Behind.
Leaving God
the
Behind.
Charter of Rights.
I remember.
Yeah, Leaving God Behind is the short title, and the subtitle is The Charter of Rights in Canada's Official Rejection of Christianity, because the Charter of Rights undermined the Christian worldview foundation of Canada, and it led to a whole bunch of Christian laws and policies being thrown out.
Right.
Because the Charter did that deliberately.
Okay, so give us that address again.
Sure. Merchantship.ca.
Perfect.
Merchantship.ca.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, look this man up. Look Michael up and pick up his books. He's been thinking about these matters for a long, long time, and he's worth reading and interacting with. Michael, thank you so much for having this conversation with us.
Yeah,
it's been a delight to talk with you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been really fun. I've loved it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, and you have a good day.
Thanks. You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.
All right. Well, that was Michael Wagner, and we're on Chinook Podcast. I think we're all very interested in this topic.
Yeah.
And Michael has an interesting perspective. He's well researched. He's intelligent. His books are easy to read. So I definitely encourage all of our listeners to look into his work.
Mm. Yes, and Canadian and Albertan history matters, and if you don't know it, you are going to fall victim to it.
Yes, indeed.
Pay attention. Pay attention,
Pay
people.
attention.
Yeah.
All right.
Right. We are the Chinook Podcast. It's been a delight to have this conversation with you all, and we hope that you have a blessed day.
All right, bye.